Hello there and welcome to this second tutorial for Sea Power. In this tutorial we're going to go over battle groups. What are the various ships you can find in Sea Power? What are their roles? How do you use them in formation? And how do you navigate them around the battlefield? This is not going to be a massively extensive video because you could spend hours talking about every single ship type, let alone all of these combined. So we're going to go over this in slightly more of a hurry. As you can imagine, the heart of at least the American carrier groups is this thing, the carrier itself. An aircraft carrier is basically a floating airport. You probably have seen these things on various videos, on various images. In this game, they do have some anti-missile defenses. Most of them. They are, however, relying upon their air wing. So they're there to provide the capability of their air wing to take off. That's their greatest offensive power. You're not to put these ships into the fight themselves. This is a little different for Russian cruisers and cruiser carrier hybrids, but more on that later. In order to launch aircraft from a carrier, you want to have this button up, the flight deck. Over here you can see what sort of aircraft they can launch. You can, for example, have F-14 Tomcats, and you can then load out these things with whatever sort of loadout you want. Do you want them to have longer range interception? Do you want to have shorter range interception? Whatever it is you require, those F-14s can generally do, but they're fighters. They don't really do much against ground targets. That's what you have your other aircraft for. Your A6, for example, have strike loadouts, they have anti-ship loadouts. Your A7s, pretty much similar, but they can also do suppression of enemy air defenses. This loads them up with a couple of missiles capable of going after radiation sources. Radars, they're able to shoot those things down. Then you have the E-2C. This is a recon platform. It is an E-2C Hawkeye, and the E-2C Hawkeye is a unit which is basically a big flying radar dish. You fly that radar dish usually behind your carrier at great altitude, and with that be able to see very, very far. We also have the AI-6B, that's an electronic warfare aircraft capable of jamming the incoming, or rather jamming the radars of other ships. They also have their seat loadout, so the same as the A6s the A7s that we have seen, suppression of enemy air defenses. And finally we have the S-3A, which is an aircraft capable of dropping sonobuoys, as well as doing anti-ship missions. So you can see that the carrier itself doesn't really do much. Yes, you do have some defensive weapons, but if the carrier has to defend itself, basically all the rings around it have failed. Everything has gone wrong if your aircraft carrier is coming under attack, and that's because aircraft carriers rely upon their friends. One of such cruisers is the Ticonderoga. In this case, it's a cruiser specialized in a particular role, anti-air warfare. It is there to defend the fleet, including the carrier, or rather, mostly including the carrier, against incoming missiles, as well as shooting down aircraft. Although most of the time, that'll get done by the aircraft from the Eisenhower, so from the carrier itself. It also carries a couple of anti-submarine weapons, as well as the RGM-84, which is a harpoon. So it's a long-range anti-ship missile. And that means this thing is relatively well-rounded, but it carries by far the most SM-2MR, Standard Missile 2, medium range. Those things are capable of going after both aircraft and surface units, so you can also use this ship to take down surface units at a range of 40 miles. They have powerful radars, and you can turn those on or off depending on whether or not you want to be detected and or get a better picture of what's going on. The Yorktown over here is another one of those Ticonderoga class cruisers, so it is also providing its escort services to the carrier over there. So you can see there's two of those cruisers. And with those, they're projecting a very powerful anti-air bubble. The next ship type over here, this is a destroyer. Now, destroyer come in various different roles, and depending on the type of era that you're playing in, different types of weaponry. In this case, a destroyer is armed with kind of all sorts of weapons, depending on what type of threat you're going for. The SM-1MR, Standard Missile 1, medium range, so it is slightly older than the Standard Missile 2s that we've seen on the Ticonderogas. These are still capable of defending the ship against incoming missiles. They carry a decent amount of them, they carry 52. They also have harpoons, they also have the RUR-5, which is an anti-submarine weapon. They have 16 torpedoes, also against submarines. You cannot launch these things against surface ships, they're anti-submarine only. Then they have a couple of Sea-Wiz close-in weapon systems, which you will also see on some of the other ships. Those are these things over here, capable of defending the ship against missiles. And we have a main gun. We have a 127mm gun or a 5-inch on the bow, and some ships carry also one on the stern, such as this kit class does. Other ships, you might find the gun amidships, in such case as an Oliver Hazard Perry class. A destroyer is slightly less punchy most of the time than a cruiser, and they are definitely fulfilling important roles because they carry an aircraft. So much like with your aircraft carrier, you can find the flight deck button here and you can launch an aircraft, such as a helicopter. With that, you can start dropping sonobuoys, capable with those sonobuoys of finding submarines. Very useful, so they're very versatile platforms. The next class is the frigates, and this is an Oliver Hazard Perry class frigate. Frigates typically are anti-submarine warfare, so they're there to defend themselves with their standard missiles, or their allies. They can also defend other ships with those. They do have harpoons if you want to go offensive against other surface ships. They have submarine weapons, or rather anti-submarine weapons in the form of those Mark 46 torpedoes. They do have their own Sea-Wiz, but this ship only carries one. Always try to take note of whatever ship type you're using, where that Sea-Wiz is. Because if it means that a missile is coming from the bow, this Sea-Wiz will not fire. You will have to turn the ship to port or to starboard, so to left or to right, in order to bring that gun to bear. This of course can be said for any kind of missile threat you're facing, or any kind of platform that you're using, but always try and take note of where exactly are my weapons. The same can be said for its main gun. This 5-incher... sorry, it's not a 5-incher. It's a 4-incher, I believe, a 76mm gun. It sits amidships. And with that, it's slightly weird positioned relative to, for example, World War II ships, which generally have a missile... Sorry, which have a gun in the bow. But that's where the Perry has its missile launcher. This Perry comes with 2 helicopters, so it is very capable of going on the offense against submarines. And depending on the ship type, sometimes you'll also find that these guys come with a towed array. So they will be dragging a sonar array behind them, trying to listen for submarines. You can send these guys out by themselves, slightly ahead of the fleet, and with that, make sure that no submarine is trying to come close. But keep in mind, any ship that you do send forward has the risk of finding itself isolated, and thus overwhelmed by the enemy missiles. This is always going to be a trade-off. Do you want to have your ships close together, pretty much like this, and be able to overlap their defenses? Or do you want to have one of these frigates, in this case, for example, the Wadsworth, to go off on a little journey and hunt down a submarine? That is going to be up to you as the commander in a scenario. Next, we also have various types of submarines. This one is the Los Angeles class submarine. This one comes equipped with the Mark 48, that's a torpedo. And they also have UGM-84. This is the same harpoon that you can see on other weapon platforms, such as some of the cruisers that we've seen, some of the destroyers and the frigates, but these are launched by the submarine. Los Angeles is an attack submarine. It is there as a hunter-killer. This thing kills both submarines and surface targets. You tend to not operate these things together, because a torpedo is really nobody's friend. Once it's lost, or once it's been launched, it has a very decent chance of also hitting your own ship. Sometimes you can still course correct these things. When a torpedo, for example, is wire guided, you can still give instructions, nope, that's not what I want you to target. But sometimes that wire breaks. In that case, you're unable to correct that torpedo. These guys tend to be operating alone. And in this case, it is a bit unusual, I'd say, seeing them fairly close to a carrier, but this is just for the example showing you what ships are in the game and kind of what their roles are. There's also the bigger submarines. This is a James Madison class ballistic missile submarine. Now, ballistic missiles, at least in its current version of the game, which is Stable 68, it's before the release, this is not actually armed with any of those ballistic missiles. You can see that they do carry all of those hatches on their backs, but they really only have Mark 48 torpedoes, and that's mostly a self-defense measure. So these ballistic missile submarines right now, I'd say, are more of a scenario tool. There's something you can hunt, there's something you can try and hunt with, if it really comes to that, but most of the time they'll try and stay hidden. The same cannot quite be said for the Russian Echo class. The Russian Echo is a guided missile submarine. The difference is, this thing is more of a strategic weapon. It carries the nuclear missiles on its back, capable of devastating whole cities, whereas the Echo is capable of going up against surface groups, using the SSN-3. Now, how is that different from the Los Angeles? Because this thing also carries cruise missiles, right? Yes, it does, but they do launch them slightly different. For example, the Los Angeles has these things in their own missile tubes, in their own torpedo tubes. So you can have these 4 tubes either launch a harpoon or a torpedo. The Echo 2 is slightly different. The Echo 2 can launch torpedoes, or they can launch, depending on their launch depth, the SSN-3. So they also carry anti-ship missiles. And with those, they can hit out to 242 miles. So they have very long-range weaponry, making them quite dangerous against surface targets. But, of course, you want to keep your submarine hidden. That's kind of the point of a submarine, staying concealed. And that's something that these guys tend not to do very well, because you can just trace a line back from a ship when there is an SSN-3 Shadok or other anti-ship missile in the air. So let's say that I would have this thing launch. I can launch this missile, and you can see the submarine is going to open a hatch. It's going to prepare the missiles. It's going to come up to the launch depth, and then it's going to launch. The problem with that capability is that you have... I'm not sure it's supposed to surface. Maybe an older type of submarine like this is. But let's say that you are a hostile faction. Your ship is, let's say, over here. You go, hold on. That missile came from somewhere. So I'm going to go and look for something along that line. And that makes submarines, especially guided missile submarines, interesting to use. They can be very, very deadly, but they can also give their position away. If you use one of these boats, I would highly recommend that you now dive as deep as you can below a thermal layer. And once you're there, try and change your course about 90 degrees relative to your last known location, thereby concealing your position. As for the other type, over here I have a Charlie 2 submarine. It is just another guided missile type submarine, but they carry some slightly different missiles. Some Russian boats also carry anti-submarine torpedoes, which are strictly anti-submarine. The Americans don't make a distinction. The Mark 48 can engage anything. These Russian ships, or Russian boats, do that a little different, such as the Set-65. It's only targeting a submarine. And some of these guys also have the smaller Set-40. And the Set-40 is a smaller torpedo, slower range, slower speed, electrical like their counterpart, the heavyweight. But they're launched from the stern, generally, which is something that the Americans don't do. They only have those 4 tubes in the front. The roles and distinctions for American ships, or let's say NATO ships, although it's mostly American ships in this case, are pretty clear. You got your aircraft carrier, you got a cruiser capable of defending the fleet, you have a destroyer capable of defending the fleet from submarines, you have frigates which can basically do a bit of everything, much like the destroyers, although they're typically more geared towards submarine defense. What about the Russians? Well, the Russians do things a little different. This, for example, is a Kiev-class aircraft carrier. Although that's debatable, because an aircraft carrier generally doesn't carry a whole assortment of missiles right on its bow, but the Russians do. So if you're using a Russian ship, this is kind of a hybrid between a cruiser and a carrier. It has some aircraft, so yes, you have a flight deck, and you're capable of launching a couple of aircraft, but not nearly as many as the Americans. At least that's, again, subject to change. But you also have missiles. In this case, you have the SSN-12, which you can see mounted on these large missile tubes here. These SSN-12s have a range of almost 300 miles. The Soviets typically rely on longer range anti-ship missiles, much longer range than the Americans, but their air power is far weaker. So you want to get a first strike in, you want to use those anti-ship missiles. And that is why the Americans have such good anti-air defense, in the form, for example, of these Ticonderoga-class cruisers. These cruisers are defending these formations from all those incoming ships, or rather incoming anti-ship missiles, launched by not only the aircraft from the Russians, but also their ships. Another type of ship that you might find is a missile boat, or a corvette. In this case, it is a torpedo boat. This is a bit of a weird one because it carries an anti-submarine torpedo, so you might typically find these not really in a big scenario, but I'd say in a scenario where you're defending a port. These things are patrolling ports and capable of going after submarines. Beyond that, they're fairly useless. Yes, they have a close-in weapon system they might be able to use to shoot down a missile, but I typically wouldn't use them for that. The Torrential is something a little different. It is a missile boat, making it smaller than a corvette, or smaller than a frigate, I should say. It is capable of launching anti-ship missiles. And with that, these small boats are capable of punching way above their weight class. Because you might not expect it, but this thing can hit you at 40 miles and then be on its way. These Styx anti-ship missiles are heat seekers, so they just go after something that's hot, such as a ship. They don't need further guidance, so what these guys typically do, these Torrentials, they launch their missiles, they turn around, and they rush away at 41 knots, because their job is at that point basically done. They do carry some anti-air missiles, but the anti-air missiles are basically this guy with his couple of anti-air missile launchers. Anti-air launchers, so basically a surface-to-air missile. And it is not particularly strong in that role. It does not carry a whole lot of defensive or offensive capabilities. The Orel is another one of those ships that makes you go, hold on. That's an aircraft carrier, right? Yes, but no. Yes, it's an aircraft carrier, and it has a flight deck pretty similar to what you might find on the American fleet. So it carries a couple of MiG-23s, which are fighters, although they can also be loaded out to do strike missions. They have another one of those aerial recon platforms, much like the Americans do with their E-2C. They have a couple of electronic warfare aircraft. They have helicopters, which are capable of going after targets with anti-submarine warfare buoys, as well as torpedoes. But like the other cruiser that you can see over there, this one also carries missiles. Right on the flight deck. Yes, you can laugh or you can be confused. They carry them right on the flight deck. So those SSN-19 anti-ship missiles, which are extremely good and very intelligent as well, you can either launch your aircraft or your missiles, but you cannot be launching both at the same time. So in this case, be careful with what those ships can do. They are very, very good, these Orel class aircraft carriers. Those SSN-19s are extremely dangerous to NATO. And in the meanwhile, this ship can also launch aircraft to defend itself. Finally, you have this thing, the Kirov. The Kirov is basically a floating bunch of missiles with a set of propulsion to it. That's basically what this thing is, and there is no American counterpart to it. This thing carries hundreds of missiles. It carries anti-submarine warfare weapons. It carries its close-in weapon systems. It has a bit of everything, making this, well, it's classed as a missile cruiser. I'd say it's a battle cruiser, because you can deliver a hammer blow to an American carrier group, and they'll be hard-pressed to defend against all those incoming missiles. They carry the same SSN-19 as the Orel class aircraft carrier that we just saw. They also have their own SAN-6, which is a surface-to-air missile, and they carry two of those different types. So they got 96 of one, 40 of another. I'm not going to go into exactly what the difference is on this particular video. They also have a couple of other type cruise missiles, the SSN-14A. These guys are more geared towards anti-submarines, and they can hit out to 27 miles. Of course, you can't really hit a submarine with a cruise missile, but that's why this missile carries a submarine or an anti-submarine torpedo and drops it where you want it. So it can be very, very dangerous in that role as well. What exactly is this thing? It does a bit of everything. It's basically what you put forward as the heart of a Russian battle group, and it defends its allies, it defends the rest of the fleet, and it has serious offensive capabilities. It's not strictly weak against submarines either, because it also carries its own helicopters. It carries 3 of those, and they are brought up onto the flight deck here. So it can do anti-submarine warfare, it can do anti-ship missiles, it can do anti-air, it can do pretty much anything. On top of that, it has very good radars, it is capable of defending itself with close-in weapon systems, for which it has ample platforms. They have a couple of those here. That's 2 per side. They have their own guns, which can also be used in close-range warfare. There's another 2 of those on the port side bow, port side stern, starboard side bow. So this thing is it's just missiles on missiles on missiles. The risk with this ship is that if it gets hit, you lose a lot of your capabilities. You lose potentially lots and lots of your missile launchers. You lose lots and lots of your offensive and defensive capabilities. And when a ship gets hit, it tends to snowball. Because if your anti-air platform, such as this cruiser can be, suddenly is knocked out, well, good luck. Because the rest of your fleet might not be that well defended. You might also come across this type of ship. It's a landing ship. It is not really a warship. It is sometimes capable of defending itself, but they're more so for scenarios where you are attempting an invasion. Most of the time, they don't actually carry anything, at least not in the current version of the game that I'm running, and they are mostly there as, let's say, targets. If you have an invasion that you are trying to thwart, you could make these things the target of your operation. They do, in this case of the Newport class, they do carry some weapons, but it's mostly for self-defense. So they do have a couple of 76mm guns, they have a 20mm Sea Whiz right there on the bow, and that's it. The Tarawa is a bit different. It is also a landing ship, but it can also do something else. This thing can launch Harriers. AV-8As, it can launch helicopters, it can even launch attack helicopters, which you can load out for close air support, anti-tank, or even air-to-air warfare. So this is a sort of mini aircraft carrier, if you will. And what I have done so far with these things is use them as the leader of a smaller mission. So this would be, for example, a platform that you try and simulate getting closer to a shore. And once you're there, you'll be able to drop off forces. Simulated. Whether it's going to make it into the game where these things actually sail up to anything and start dropping off troops, I'm not sure if we'll ever get there. I would love it if we do, because that would definitely be very interesting to play around with. But for now, they're basically considered mini carriers, although some of the naval buffs out there might disagree. As for formations and how you position your units, most of the time, the most key element of your units, in this case the aircraft carrier, goes in the heart of your formation. I highly recommend that you make that the formation leader. This way, everything is going to revolve around the formation leader, so in this case the Eisenhower. If I tell the Eisenhower to change its course and head northeast, not only will the Eisenhower change its course, the escorts will also maintain their position in the formation. Some of them will speed up, some of them will slow down, some of them will figure out, okay, I need to rush to a noodle site, but whatever they do, they try to maintain their formation. Most of the time, an aircraft carrier will also rely upon its air wing, for example, but let's say that a Kirov is your formation leader. In such a case, a Kirov would be at the heart of your formation. The escort ships are generally positioned, ideally, in a sort of 360-degree perimeter. This way you have anti-air defenses, you have anti-submarine defenses, you have anti-air defenses closer to the carrier, but of course you can change these formations up as you see fit. Let's start out with the ships outside of a formation. I'm going to right-click on the Eisenhower and let's say formation, disband. This is now, all these ships are now single. They don't actually follow any orders other than their own. They're not part of a formation. Now I'm going to turn the Eisenhower into a formation. I'm going to say create formation. And with that, the Eisenhower is now a formation of 1. There's one single ship in here. And I can only move the Eisenhower to basically wherever I want in the formation. But since it's the leader, it's not going to do much. So I'm going to rename this as the Eisenhower. The Eisenhower formation. I now want to have this Ticonderoga join that formation. You right-click it, you go formation, formation join, Eisenhower. Yorktown, formation, join formation, Eisenhower. Sacramento, this is a resupply ship. I didn't cover this category because it's basically there as a bit more storytelling of an element. As far as I know, these ships currently don't fulfill any role. Ships don't need to be refueled, they don't need to be rearmed. Well, yes, they do need to be rearmed as you're expending your weapons, but that's not currently part of the game. Right now, if I don't change anything, these ships will maintain their position in the formation where they were. So essentially where I found them. That's not what I want. I want to have these ships slightly in front of the carrier. So I'm going to drag them over to where I want them to be. Of course, this is not where they are. It's going to take them a little bit of time to figure out, okay, sorry, I need to be at a new position. You can see that the Yorktown now takes up its new position. It's currently 10:04, 10:05, and they're expected to arrive at 10:12. Ticonderoga at 10:11, and the Eisenhower just continues on its course. This is the way that you can set up your formations. You can set these formations as you wish, and I do recommend that you experiment with them. Sometimes you want to have ships farther afield, sometimes you want to have them closer together. It depends on the threat, it depends on the scenario. There's a lot of different considerations to go into this. Whatever happens, don't lead with an aircraft carrier, unless something has gone horribly wrong and all your escorts are dead. But ideally, just position your escorts, let's say, a little bit in front of the carrier, and make sure that the carrier stays safe. The heart of your formation, the heart of your battle group should always stay safe. As mentioned, it's not a fully extensive video because I want to keep this thing fairly succinct and keep you at least updated on what ship does what. But this is at least the basis of what ships do. Frigates tend to be all-rounders, but tend to gear towards anti-submarine warfare. Destroyers are more all-rounders. Cruisers, typically air defense. If you're talking about the Americans. Sometimes the Russians refer to these aircraft carriers as cruisers. These are aircraft carrying cruisers. This is a way to get around particular treaties, I believe. And of course you have the landing ships. And you have some escorts, corvettes, or missile boats. These all tend to sort of fall in the same category. They're hit and run ships. Launch your missiles, get out. That's basically all that they're supposed to do. I hope you found this video useful. If you have any additions, by all means, leave a comment down below. Help out the other players who are just starting out with this game, because sea power is very extensive. It will take you a while to figure out what ship does what, especially with the different doctrines in the game. The NATO ships tend to be generally pretty well specialized. The Russian ships, I would say, not as much, or their specializations are somewhat different. So experiment, try, figure out, learn, make mistakes, learn more. I hope you found it useful. If you did, please hit the like button so that more people can find this video. If you have any questions, please leave them down below in the comments. I might be able to answer those there. And if not, I'll try and make a different video answering your question. Thank you for watching. Please enjoy sea power, and good luck out there.